Okay, guys, so let's go right ahead because I have lots of slides and not too much time. We will go through different MITRE ATT&CK techniques which might use DNS, and we will look at it how different attackers, how different threat actors are using those techniques, and some specific offensive techniques involving DNS. So if anybody is thinking about secure DNS, they usually think like, yeah, okay, I could block malicious domain names. So if user will click that, then of course I can block it. So that's the most simple way how you can how the attackers are using domain name system, right? Providing a fully qualified domain name which will attract the user, and it can be malware behind, or it can be a phishing page or whatever. So let's just have a very quick warm up with some recent campaigns. So this one is from about a week ago. That's a Hydra Android malware, and it's something we can see a lot of times. It's using of fresh domains by the threat actors. So here is perfect example. Actually, I've seen the first screenshot. It's from customers' reporting system, where we can see that some of the employees clicked a link, which is not malicious, which was not malicious, seen as malicious at this time. It was Saturday 4 p.m. It was just a fresh domain name, which was registered around 6 hours before the user actually clicked the link. And what we can see on the right bottom is a screenshot from VirusTotal, where you can see detections by different antivirus engines. And you can see that it was not detected as malicious until actually, next day, or actually 2 days even, right? And it was slowly growing. It's still not too big because it's a campaign targeting just Poland. So not every antivirus system is actually detecting that as malicious. But it's a very typical example that attackers are registering the domain name and using it the same day or next day for the campaign. They have limited time to do so because usually in simple attacks, they will just use some fake data to register the domain name, maybe stolen credit card. So they don't have too much time when they can use this domain name and try to use it right away or in next 1-2 days. Very similar case, but this is SMS phishing, so smishing in Czech Republic. Very fresh, just from last weekend, last Monday also. The domain name was registered on September 5th. Actually, on passive DNS system, we saw first query just 10 minutes later. But it was not until 7th of September when actually people start to notice that this domain name is malicious, as you can see on the left side on the bottom. So exactly the same technique, basically using a new fresh domain name. And as I said, we can see that very often on some simple campaigns. This one is actually quite interesting because the screenshot from these phishing web pages, especially the one on the right bottom, basically the attack was targeted towards Czech Republic users, but actually the language on this web page is not Czech, it's Slovenian. So someone who was doing this campaign is definitely not from Czech Republic, probably not even from our region of Europe, because in Central Eastern Europe, people know the difference between Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Slovenia, right? They're totally different countries with different languages, and you would never use, different language to target, people in Czech Republic. So it's not very well prepared. Such simple attacks is also, simple defense techniques, and, very simple technique is just quarantine a fresh domain name. I always say domain names are like a good wine. It shouldn't be fresh, right? Very often we can see lookalike domain names, so domain names which try to try to mimic some legitimate domain names, and a lot of security vendors are doing lookalike detections, but they are mostly focusing on some global brands. When it comes to local brands, it's not that common, and that's why such domain names can be undetected for a long time. So this is example, for lookalike domain name for InPost, which is Polish delivery company. And this domain name was registered around end of February this year, but it was not blocked anywhere until end of June. So it's like 4 months. Normally, people say like, phishing pages will be blocked or disappeared within hours. But here, when we have a local threat, actually you can see that's not true, and it can last much, much longer. Again, attackers are probably from different country, because on the fake page on the left, we see lack of Polish national characters, which we can see on the legitimate web page on the right side. Very interesting case combining lookalike domain names with web advertisement. So this is something seen a few months ago, again in Poland. So attackers register a domain name which looks a little bit like a Getting Bank domain name, but in addition, they actually bought advertisement on Google. So if a user is actually entering Getting Bank in the Google, they had as a first link, there was an ad bought by the attacker. And unfortunately, some people, especially older people, don't use the URL address bar, but they just enter their bank name into the Google search, and that's how they go to the bank. So some people might be lured by that. Another example of lookalike, and Adam Lange 2 days ago was talking about how phishing kits are trying to distract, threat researchers. This is one of the examples. When you enter such lookalike domain name without exact URL, actually you're redirected to the legitimate BNP Paribas web page. And this causes some security systems, so URL filtering system, to classify this domain name as there is a classification for the legitimate domain name. So in this case, this phishing domain name was categorized as financial services, for example, in Palo Alto, in ForcePoint, actually in a few URL filtering solutions. Okay, let's have something more interesting. This was just a warm-up. So DGA. Yesterday, there was a nice session about DGA algorithms, but it was like most typical DGAs, which generate domain names out of random characters, or in some more advanced cases, out of whole words, in case of dictionary DGA. But this year, I've seen completely different approach to DGA. So there was a Docker malware which was infecting Docker servers in the public cloud. So it was scanning for Docker servers in public cloud and trying to exploit some default configuration features. And how Docker was resolving its command and control server was by using Dogecoin cryptocurrency blockchain. So how did that work? Basically, to get domain name of the C2 server, the malware was sending a query to blockchain.info API, asking about how much money was spent from a hard-coded wallet address. And this wallet was controlled by the attacker. So attacker was generating a domain name just by spending some money from this wallet. And then the malware was accessing information about how much money was spent through the API call. And based on that, it was generating a domain name. None of the existing DGA detection algorithms will work here, because most of DGA detection algorithms will look for a lot of DNS queries which result in non-existent domain name answer, because that's how DGA algorithm works. It generates a lot of domain names using random characters until it will match the domain name which was registered by the attacker. The rest, like 1,000 per day, will be actually having a response that this domain name does not exist. In this case, there are no random domain names. Actually, attacker is just generating domain name based on the money spent from the wallet. So quite interesting example. Okay, Next case, technique for command and control tactic, ingress tool transfer. Previous name was remote copy file transfer. It has changed recently when the sub-techniques were introduced to MITRE ATT&CK. And here is an example which was described by Asset in June. You have the presentation, you have the links there, so it's good to go there and actually read in details how it works. They provided like a 60 pages, very detailed report, so kudos to Asset team. So they reported attack by Invisimo group, and it was targeting high-profile organizations in military sector in Eastern Europe. They were using DNS to download new malicious components of this malware. So when they infected the computer, they tried to download, new stuff on this infected machine. They were using null records by default, which for me was, well, it might be a little bit surprising because null records are very good for the data transfer because you can put any kind of data inside, and you could put like 250 bytes. The problem is they are very rarely seen on the network. So it's quite easy to detect that as an anomaly because, of course, if you monitor what kind of queries you normally have in your network, but then if you do that, then you will quickly notice that you have quite a large amount of null queries, which is not typical. Maybe they were thinking like using text records, TXT records would be detected by some security solutions. Maybe some firewalls or some DNS firewalls are looking into text record data, and then it could detect something automatically. So maybe that was the reason. They are using DNS because in this case, they can actually get the data from the internet, even if the infected machine is in an isolated segment without internet access, because DNS resolver is actually working as a kind of a proxy. It gets a DNS request from the client, and it creates a new request with its source address to the internet. So even if the infected client does not have internet access, actually it can download data from the internet using DNS resolver as a proxy. Next, tactics and techniques. So again, command and control exfiltration. I think those tactics are the most interesting from DNS perspective. So how actually you can exfiltrate data out of the network using DNS queries? Basically, you need to register a domain name and set up a name server which will handle this domain name requests. Then from the infected endpoint, so in the last phase of the infection, when you want to exfiltrate data to your external server, basically you can, and in advanced attack, it's usually done, attacker will encrypt the data. Then the data needs to be encoded because it will be sent in form of FQDN, fully qualified domain name in the DNS query. So it needs to comply RFC. RFC is saying you can only use letters, digits, dash, and underscore. So you need to use some algorithms such as hex, such as base 32, or modified base 64, so base 64 URL, because standard base 64 contains plus sign and slash, which are not allowed in the DNS names. So you usually use base 64 URL. DNS system basically is case insensitive. So when attacker is using base 64, he's a little bit at risk that he will lose some data, because when you send some query, let's actually do that. When we will ask about, let's say, like this one, sorry, without short, because we won't see it. Then you can see actually this name server, which I'm using, still has the same case, right? But if you will ask, for example, Cloudflare, then you can see that they do not hold the same case. So you have no guarantee when you use base 64 that it will work. So it's a little bit risky. Then after you have this encoded data, you need to cut it into the chunks, because in the subdomain you can have maximum 63 characters. So you need to cut it into some chunks of data, maybe one chunk, maybe more, depends. And then you send those individual queries to local DNS server used by the endpoint which was infected. So let's look at some examples. So we will see also different kind of encoding of data used by different threat actors depending on their skills, actually. So here we have a point of sale malware, Alina, that was described on Visa web pages, actually. And here you can see they are probably using base 64. We can have a look at that in a second. Because you have small and capital letters here. So let's have this in CyberChef. Let's see what's there. Okay, so I copied the part of FQDN without the top level domain name to the CyberChef. And I know what's in there because I read the research. So basically it's base 64 encoded, as I said, modified one, URL safe. And then actually it is just using XOR. If we don't know the key, we can actually use brute force in CyberChef, and we can have a look what is making some sense. And actually here it is. So you can see that here is ID of infected machine. Here is the name, Donovan PC. I don't remember what was the one, probably a stage, post.exe. So the executable, which is actually holding data about credit cards. And here you have credit card data information. So the number and the validity date plus some additional data. So this is stored just in DNS query. The bad thing about it is that if the attacker is using command and control or exfiltration channel over HTTPS, the data is transferred from the infected endpoint towards the C2 server, and it's encrypted in between. Here, if you are using DNS, actually on the internet, you have a lot of passive DNS systems. So whatever will be sent to DNS resolvers probably will be stored at some passive DNS system and will stay there. You know, internet is like Las Vegas, right? What happens on the internet stays on the internet. So we can have a look here. Actually, my session expired, but it doesn't matter. Here, I'm using a research tool from Infoblox, which contains passive DNS data. And here we see analytics, the -aka DNS domain name. And we see that in passive DNS, we are actually seeing all those queries. And the recent one was from today, actually. So this malware is infecting, you know, credit card processing data computers as we speak, and it's exfiltrating data all the time. And actually, almost anybody on the internet who has access to some passive DNS system will have access to this credit card data information. So if you are a victim, you are actually lucky if the threat actor was doing some kind of encryption. If not, everybody can see that. In this case, this came from Visa report, so I hope you know this information. These credit cards were already invalidated. Okay, good. Go back to Invisimo for a second. So I was saying that they are doing infiltration, so downloading data from the internet, but actually also sending data to the C2 server using DNS. And Invisimo is an advanced group, so they are targeting military institutions, so probably there is some government behind. And you can see the difference, like most simple attackers are using hex encoding, maybe base 64, but in advanced attacks, APT groups usually use something like base 32 and with non-standard dictionary. So here we have one of the examples for Invisimo. This is the dictionary they used. In addition, I noticed that in all queries they sent, I could find 16A letters. And I have no idea why they did that, but one of the guesses could be that if you use 16 characters which are the same, the entropy of the whole string will be much lower. So in case somebody uses detection based on entropy only, then they can actually avoid this detection because they are lowering the level of entropy just by using, but just by repeating the same characters several times. Another example of advanced groups, wellness malware, probably related to APT29, according to some UK and US security institutions. They were targeting companies which are doing research related to COVID-19 vaccine. And they are using DNS, they are using HTTPS for C2 for data exfiltration. And here we also can see that they are using base 32 encoding with non-standard dictionary. And here is the dictionary. So it's even more, non-standard than the one used by the Invisimo group. This attack is not new. So usually in the last slides, I was showing something from 2020. This one is a little bit longer, but I think it's worth to mention because it's one of the most advanced used of DNS transmission during C2 phase. So Dark Hydros group was targeting also government agencies in the Middle East in this case. And the transmission they were using was randomized as much as possible. So what they randomized in DNS query was the query size. So the hostname part of the query was between 30 to 43 characters. So there was not a pattern which could be detected easily. That was randomized. Delay between the queries. It was also randomized, and it was not that small. It was more or less 3 seconds. Plus minus 0.6 second. So between every query, there was slightly different delay. They could randomize query types. So they could ask about A record, quad A, CNAME, and so on. And they were also randomizing domain name out of a dozen which they provided in the malware. So the transmission they were using was quite, well, not looking exactly as a machine generated. So it was not so easy, and many security systems are failing to detect this transmission. What they also did was actually, they were doing a test, what kind of query records are blocked by a security system. So they have, in the table, you have different comments which could be sent from the C2 server to the infected machine. And one of them was test mode. And then the endpoint, infected endpoint, would actually send some queries with different records. So they will first send a query record, a query for one of these domain names. If that would be not blocked, then they would use just a query for the further transmission. If that would be blocked, they would try quad A. If that would be blocked, a CNAME, MX, SOA. So they would try different record types. And the reason why they did so is because they did reconnaissance phase very well, and they knew what kind of security systems they could find in their target. So in this case, target was using Cisco Umbrella secure DNS system. And Umbrella has this feature that they actually block only those green types of queries, and they do not block those red, MX, SOA, NS, and SIG, even if the category for the domain name is malicious. And here you have a screenshot from January this year for this OWA365.bit domain name that actually, when you ask Umbrella about a record, it's blocked as a malicious category. But if you send the same domain name in the query, but change record type to NS or SOA, it's actually allowed, even though that the category is blocked. So here at the reconnaissance phase, attackers really, did good job on understanding what are the systems behind the target and how you could bypass them. Next techniques in command and control phase. So dynamic resolution and protocol tunneling. So dynamic resolution, you can use DNS in different ways to resolve an IP address. And here, going back to the previous example, how you can, for example, use SOA record to get IP address of the C2 server. So it's very easy, because in SOA record, you have master name server in the first field, email of the administrator in the second field, and then you have a 32-bit integer, which is serial number of the zone file, and then some TTL stuff, also 32-bit integers. So you can use, for example, serial number field, which is 32-bit integer, to store IP address. IPv4 address is also 32-bit integer. So actually you can just even, for the purpose of pinging this IP address, you can just copy and paste it, and it will be displayed as a 4-octet format. So this is very simple, and it can be used to bypass DNS firewalls. Another way which works for example, in Cloudflare secure DNS, both the commercial one and the one you can use at home, they have 1111 for families, which can block malware and some blocked categories, is again using these different cases. So well, let's do live actually. So for example, if we would ask Cloudflare, for example, for families, for this light boy top, let's make it short. So you can see it was actually blocked because this is malware related domain name, but it's enough to just change, one letter, and then it's resolved to the malicious IP. So it can also be used to bypass some firewalls. Okay, let's look at the tunneling. So DNS over HTTPS is one of the ways to tunnel DNS protocol. And as colleagues from Kaspersky mentions, some malware some attackers start to use DNS over HTTPS. From my experience, what I've seen so far, attackers usually use either Google's DNS over HTTPS or Cloudflare, because those two are used by Google Chrome and by Firefox. And what attackers want to achieve by using DOH is not the DOH itself, but basically they want to hide in the legitimate traffic. And right now there should be some traffic generated by the browsers trying to resolve domain names over DNS over HTTPS from Google or from Cloudflare. So they will not use their own DOH server because it doesn't make sense. They want to hide in the legitimate traffic, so they will try to use Google and Cloudflare. And this is one example, 6bot. As you see, they try to resolve C2 server IP address using DNSGoogle.com DOH service. It's very easy to block actually, because first DNSGoogle.com has to be resolved to an IP address. And if we are talking about enterprises, basically you should never allow your employees to use any kind of external, open DNS resolver. It doesn't matter if it's using DNS over HTTPS, DNS over TLS, it doesn't matter. Basically, you should always block this access. So in case of DNS, you block port 53. In case of DOH, you need to block IP addresses of known resolvers such as 8888, 1111, and so on. There was a very interesting case of using DOH to resolve something. Let's look at this example and see what is it. Let me just copy it into my clipboard. 1 second. Okay. So here, the attacker was asking Google.com, DOH at Google, to resolve DMARC record for jQuery-update.js.com. So they ask about TXT record. And you can see that it looks like, a little bit looks like a DKIM record. So the record which is used to store signatures for email. And the key should be RSA. And here, theoretically, should be a base 64 encoded key. But actually, it was not a key. So let's move back again to the CyberChef. Let's treat these records not as a whole, but let's use slash as something which is splitting this text into separate records. So let's copy, for example, one of these to CyberChef, and let's do base64 decoding once. And guess what? This looks like another base64 string, right? So let's decode it once again. And here you got the number. Let's try to use it as an IPv4 address, right? So we see how different techniques can be using DNS to resolve domain name, not necessarily, asking for an A record, but it could be an SOA record holding some data. It could be, TXT record having something pretending to be DKIM record, right? So it's quite interesting to look how those attackers are trying to find out new ways. So, as I said, regarding DOH, I don't think it's like a big change in the security space. People are afraid of that. But actually, in case of enterprises, in case of company security, you basically should do what you were always doing. So you are blocking port 53 to block public DNS resolvers. And now you need to just use different way to block all public DOH resolvers. And this has to be done in a different way, of course. It's not just about blocking the port. You need to block FQDNs of those, DNS.google.com, DNS.google, because they need to be resolved. And also on your firewalls, you should block IP addresses such as, Quad A, Quad 1, Quad 9, and so on and so on. And you can get list of publicly available resolvers here on the GitHub. Of course, if you can, would be best to analyze, inspect, decrypt and inspect HTTPS traffic and look in those packets in search for actually DOH requests. Okay, that's all from my side. I think I was a little bit hurried, to be honest, because I was afraid that it can take too much time. But we will have more time for questions then, or maybe also some live shows in the Q&A session. So back to you, Ido.